Welcome to our 9-part series, Know the Declaration, where we focus on one article of the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights in each segment. The Declaration reaffirms women's sex-based rights as set out in the 1979 UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW, and the 1993 UN Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women. The Declaration also affirms the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women and girls that result from replacing the category of sex with that of gender identity. Today we're discussing Article 1 and the U.S. Equality Act with Kara Dansky. She is a feminist, a civil rights lawyer, and independent consultant. She served on the board of WOLF, the Women's Liberation Front, for 4 years, and now heads up the Women's Human Rights Campaign Committee on Law and Legislation. I'm Catherine Acosta, co-chair of the Interim Steering Committee of the U.S. chapter of the Women's Human Rights Campaign. Welcome, Kara.
Hi, thank you for having me.
I'm so excited to talk to you about this. I wanted to start by asking you about the newly formed Committee on Law and Legislation. What's that about? What inspired you to organize that, and what do you see as the mission of the committee?
Well, thank you for asking. I had reached out to Joe Brew, who had co-founded the Women's Human Rights Campaign globally, and suggested that we convene a committee of legal experts to talk about the promotion of the Declaration globally, starting with the UN. So our committee consists of women attorneys, law students, paralegals, and other legal experts all around the world. And we're focusing right now on the United Nations and the promotion of the Declaration before various UN bodies. And we're very excited to do that. We're at the very beginning stages right now, so we're still trying to figure out exactly what we're going to do and when we're going to do it. But it's really exciting, and I'm very happy to be chairing the committee. The law functions in very different ways in different countries. And so I'm somewhat familiar with how the law functions in the US, both in terms of legislative law with Congress and with local legislative bodies and with the courts, and of course also with the administration. But I'm also very aware that the way that the law functions in other countries is very different from how it functions here. And so one of the long-term goals of the committee is to help women around the world who are in the legal profession in some capacity, help us educate ourselves and each other about how the law is functioning in various places around the world.
Cool. That sounds great. That sounds great. Well, let's move on to the Article 1 of the Declaration. And I'll read you a little bit of the article. I know you know it, but just so everyone else can hear it. Article 1 reaffirms that the rights of women are based on the category of sex. And it cites the UN Gender Equality Glossary to define sex as the physical and biological characteristics that distinguish males from female. So Article 1 calls on states to maintain the category of sex rather than gender identity, and asserts that including men who claim a female gender identity into the category of women in law and public policy constitutes discrimination against women. So why don't you start by telling us why is it important to retain sex as a discrete legal category in law?
So this is absolutely critical. And I think we need to start by going back a bit and acknowledging that it's no mystery that United States law and many other countries' laws have discriminated against women as women for, in this country, centuries. We have been excluded from civil society. Of course, for a long time, we were excluded from the franchise. We were prohibited from serving on juries. We were discriminated against in the marriage context. We were not allowed to own property. And we were discriminated against specifically because we are women. And sex meant something then. Everyone knew what the word sex meant when women were being discriminated against because we are women throughout US law. And that has now started to be getting replaced by the category of gender identity. And it's important for everyone to understand that sex and gender identity are completely incompatible when it comes to protecting people, specifically women, in the law. You cannot have both. The law cannot protect women as women and also protect men who claim to be women.
Why is that? Why can you not have both?
Men aren't women. Men who claim to be women are still men, and as such, they are prioritized and have been prioritized for hundreds of years in the US, for thousands of years globally. And if we're serious about protecting women in the law, we have to acknowledge that sex is a meaningful legal category. Gender identity is simply an idea.
Mm-hmm. Right, and I'm thinking specifically too. If you're trying to protect both, there's a clash. For example, we just have this thing going on with in California with women in the prisons there, where a bill is going to be passed that would allow men who identify as women to be in California women's prisons. I mean, I think that's one area where you immediately see what the conflict is.
Absolutely. I myself have spoken with some women who are incarcerated in Texas, and they told me their story of being held in a locked prison cell with a man who claims to be a woman. And they told me their story of how they were absolutely terrified for the whole period of time that they were incarcerated in that locked cell. So we could use the example of prisons. We could talk also about the importance of protecting women's shelters, the importance of protecting women's sports. All of these things are created specifically in order to remedy centuries and thousands of years of discrimination against women as women. And it's very important that we continue to do that.
Right, right. So if we look at the Equality Act, then this is the U.S. legislation sponsored by the Democrats, passed in the House, I think it was last May of 2019. And the Equality Act is intended, I understand, to build on to amend the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And they want to extend bans on discrimination to cover sexual orientation and gender identity. So that seems like a good thing to do, that we need to extend protection to these categories. But why is that? Why would it be a problem?
So one could argue that it's a very good idea to include sexual orientation in the list of protected categories in the law, and that may very well be a very good idea, and most signatories to the Declaration probably would support that. I would also say that it is already unlawful in the United States to discriminate on the basis of sex stereotyping, at least in the employment context. And there's an argument to be made that the prohibition on sex stereotyping would include a prohibition on discriminating on the basis of sexual orientation. And that's something that can be talked about in legislative bodies and worked out in the courts. But the specific problem with the Equality Act is that it does include gender identity as a basis for discrimination. And the problem there is that, again, gender identity is not an immutable characteristic. It's simply an idea that some people have about whether they are or are not members of a discrete sex class, or what is currently being talked about as a third sex class, or neither male nor female, which should not be protected in the law for several reasons, one of which is that women deserve to be protected in the law, the other of which is that it simply makes no sense. People are either female or male, including people with disorders of sexual development, which are often referred to as intersex people. But people who have disorders or differences of sexual development are still either male or female. Every single person who has ever existed on this planet is either male or female.
Equality Act, then, if that's passed, will that negate like Title IX, for example? Title IX says sex. It doesn't say anything about gender identity.
Title becomes a little bit complicated because of specific regulations that the administration promulgated after Title IX was enacted that do continue to allow recipient institutions to discriminate on the basis of sex in appropriate circumstances. So it's a little bit complicated in terms of how it will all work out legally. We saw yesterday, for example, the Department of Education issued a brand new ruling. This is just as of August 31st, 2020, a brand new ruling that the Connecticut Inter-Athletic Association is violating Title IX by allowing boys to compete in girls' sports. So that seems to be a positive development. And in issuing that ruling, it relied specifically on the Title IX implementing regulations that do permit discrimination on the basis of sex in appropriate circumstances. So it's all a little bit complicated, and we'll have to see how it will play out. But if we can at least get gender identity removed from the terms of the Equality Act, that would be a very positive step.
Right. It sounds like that even if the Equality Act did pass, there would be a lot of legal battles about it. Because, as you say, this is a clear conflict. You know, one of the things I always think about is how when I first had to start dealing with law and contracts and so on in my own work, one thing I really loved about the law is at the beginning of a legal document, everything is defined very, very clearly. You know, the producer shall mean this, the director shall mean this, you know, the educational distribution shall mean this. And so it's astonishing to me that now we can start having laws where things are not defined properly. For instance, in the Equality Act, I think gender identity is defined as the gender-related identity. Gender identity is defined as the gender-related identity, appearance, mannerisms, or other gender-related characteristics of an individual, regardless of the individual's designated sex at birth. That doesn't seem like consistent with what's gone in the past in terms of carefully defining things in law and public policy. What do you think?
In my experience, every single definition of gender identity that I have ever read is either completely circular or it is grounded in sex-based stereotypes that I would argue have no basis in the law. And the definition that you just read from the Equality Act is stunning in that it incorporates both. It is both circular and embraces sex-based stereotypes. So for example, I recently read a court case in which a court decided that a female person is actually a boy because the person cut her hair short and chose to wear quote unquote masculine clothing. These sex-based stereotypes are absolutely regressive. They're things that feminists have been fighting against for centuries, and we need to continue to fight against them. That's all that gender identity is. It's just grounded in sex-based stereotypes. It has no basis in material reality, and it has no basis being enshrined in law. As you say, the definitions that are put forth make absolutely no sense. And you're right that traditionally it's considered appropriate for court documents to define terms. And the word astonishing is a good one. It has been absolutely astonishing to watch most courts that have considered the matter of gender identity to just obliterate the category of female. It is nothing short of astonishing. We have seen at least 2 instances in which federal judges have admonished attorneys regarding the use of language. There was one court that ordered an attorney not to use the phrase opposite sex because the judge found that language to be confusing. And there's another example.
This man should not be on the bench if he's confused about that.
One would think. And there's another example in which an attorney was prohibited from using the word male to describe males. This is what's happening in our court system. It is absolutely astonishing.
Oh, I had one other question for you about the Equality Act. I had read a scholarly article about it that argued that in the Equality Act, where there's a clash over gender identity and sex, that gender identity would be prioritized. Is that right?
It depends on how courts will ultimately read the statute, but you know what we do know is that at least throughout the federal judiciary, as we've seen these gender identity cases play out, the courts tend to be absolutely favoring gender identity over the protection of women and girls.
Why is that, do you think?
It's really difficult to speculate as to why the federal judiciary has gone down this route, but women and girls are continuing to fight it out in the courts.
The Idaho legislature passed a law that boys who identify as girls cannot compete in girls' sport. And now the ACLU is bringing a lawsuit, and an injunction. My understanding is an injunction was issued saying they can't implement that law until the ACLU lawsuit is heard. Is that correct?
It's correct that the court issued a preliminary injunction holding that the state cannot enforce the law for now, but the case is still pending. So we'll see what happens. The court also allowed 2 female athletes to intervene as parties in that litigation. So that's a good thing.
Okay. So what should we do about the Equality Act? I know you have given trainings to women on how to lobby legislators, and I know you don't have time to do all that today, but I was wondering if you could give us a few tips on what we might do to push back against this and how we might approach our legislators.
So if we're talking about the Equality Act, that is a bill, as you say, that is currently pending before the United States Senate. And it's important for everyone to know a couple of things. One is that all of our representatives and senators have local offices. So in order to communicate with your representatives and senators, you don't have to come to Washington, D.C. You can reach out to your representatives and senators, specifically with the Equality Act, your senators, because that's where the bill currently is, and speak with the staff who are in the local offices. And especially now, while we're still dealing with this pandemic and this lockdown, they will talk, they will schedule meetings, and you can talk with them virtually. I think that it's often intimidating for people to even consider reaching out to their senators. But keep in mind, your senators work for you, and they're required to listen to you. Not the actual senators themselves necessarily, but they all have staff, and they will listen. They will take your opinions into consideration. So with respect to the Equality Act, the time to start doing that is now, because candidate Biden has committed to passing it as one of his first actions should he prevail in the November 2020 election. And it's very important now to start talking with senators about specifically why the Equality Act is bad for women and girls. However, advocacy does not have to be limited to the United States Senate or the United States House of Representatives. We are all also represented at our local, county, and state levels. And chances are likely that no matter where any of us lives, there is some legislation that is being put forth before a city council or a county board of supervisors or a state legislature that would affect this topic of gender identity. And there's advocacy to be done there. And unlike with the United States Senate, you actually might be able to get an actual meeting with your actual city council people. So it's really just a matter of getting on the internet, Googling the name of your city or town, city council, figuring out who represents you on the city council. The information is all there. Sometimes you have to dig a little bit to find it. But just keep in mind that the people that we elect to serve us on our city councils and on our state legislatures and in the United States Congress, they all work for us. They are paid with our tax dollars, and they are required to listen to what we think. I also just could point out that it doesn't matter for this purpose what political party your representatives belong to. If you're a Democrat and you're represented by a Republican, that Republican still represents you, even if you didn't vote for the person. So if you're a Republican and you're represented by a Democrat, the same thing is true. So your elected representatives represent you, even if you didn't vote for them, and they need to listen.
Awesome. That sounds great. I wanted to ask you about one last thing. I was involved with our Wisconsin Revolution a few years ago, and they brought in a professional lobbyist, and he sort of gave us tiers of influence. I don't know if you would call it influence or how they would listen to you, but he said basically the lowest level is like an email or a written letter, a postal letter. But then he said if you go several people together, go and see in person, they pay more attention to that than they would to an email. Or if you can go as a representative of a group And the best of all, he said, was if you send representatives from a coalition of groups. So you have people from several groups, and that would have the most impact. So I wonder what you think about that, and if those are good tips as well.
I would agree with that, and I think those are good tips. Coalitions are great. When you can represent a coalition, that's ideal. In-person meetings are also the best once our legislative offices open up again.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I would also just say it's very helpful when you're meeting with elected officials or their staffs to remember they're not necessarily subject matter experts on these topics, because they're required to legislate on a broad range of topics and they can't possibly be experts on everything. So it's very helpful when you go to have these meetings and conversations to have a very specific set of talking points. Have 3 points that you just want to drive home. Have your narratives and your bullet points within that, but keep in mind they're not subject matter experts necessarily, and it really helps to keep things to 3 basic points that you really want them to hear.
Right, right, cool. So is there anything else I haven't asked you about that has to do with basically Article 1, the sex as a discrete category in law? Anything else you want to say before we finish up?
Well, just thanks again for doing this, and I just can't iterate enough how important it is to protect sex in the law, because that's the only way to protect women and girls.
That's great. Kara, you've been awesome. You're so well spoken, and this is fantastic. I can't wait to get it edited and get it up there. Thank you so much. I look forward to working with you some more now that you're with us on WHRC.
Absolutely.